Everything, everything gonna be all right this morning.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another episode of It's Me Speaking to You. I am, as always, your host, Mr. Jeffrey Wilson, coming to you live and direct from the gateway to the West, St. Louis, Missouri. And today, folks, we have on a very talented filmmaker who I've become a huge fan of lately. Not even just filmmaker, historian, filmmaker, documentary filmmaker. This gentleman popped on my radar a few years ago, completely accidentally. I was talking to a neighbor in my backyard as we barbecued, sipping some beers. He was talking about a show he had just seen, and he was fascinated by a gentleman he had seen depicted in the show. The gentleman's name was Maserati Rick. And so we started talking about this, and I'm always a big organized kind of crime, gangland kind of fan, and that's the show he was watching, Gangland, where they talked about not only Maserati Rick, this gentleman Maserati Rick, but this whole cast of characters, essentially this organized crime organization which existed in Detroit, not only during Maserati Rick's time, because it goes back quite a ways. And this gentleman, our guest today, has chronicled a great deal of that very succinctly and very accurately in a very entertaining fashion. It's very informative. Ladies and gentlemen, he is the director of several documentary films, which we're going to talk about today. He's teasing and has a GoFundMe set up for his most recent film he's going after, which is called Police State, and their most recent one before that was called Killing Jimmy Hoffa, which we're going to get into all of that. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that was a little long-winded, but please welcome to the program, straight from the Detroit, Michigan, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Al Prophet. How you doing, sir?
Oh, thank you. That was quite an introduction. I should hire you as my PR person. That was good. Thank you.
Yeah, man, I've been a fan. You, and to say you didn't necessarily do the original thing I saw on Gangland, but through that research, it did take me to some other films that you have produced and been a part of dealing with that very same subject. Why don't you tell me and tell us a little bit before we get too deep into this particular subject matter, how did you get into filmmaking? You're really good at it, and obviously you have a hankering for history. How did you get yourself into this field of work?
Well, from the time I was a kid, I wanted to possibly be a director, but going to college, didn't want to major in film. That seemed kind of ridiculous to me for some reason. So I got a master's degree in economics, actually, and while I was finishing that up, I decided instead of paying to go to film school, I would make people pay me to learn how to become a filmmaker, and I started doing some music video, rap videos for rappers in Detroit, like low budget, couple $100, and then that kind of grew, and I got had a run of being the go-to guy for the Detroit rap community, of doing videos for them, and when I got tired of that, then I decided, okay, well, how can I make a film without having, $1 million to make, a movie? And I said, well, let me do documentaries. Where do my interests lie? What can I do that would be interesting and important, and who do I have access to? And I said, well, Detroit crime. And at the time, I had just completed my master's, and I was working at Wayne State University, which is a huge, university right in downtown Detroit, and I was doing a lot of data analysis involving demographics of the city, but also for the police department, we were getting all kind of crime data. So between me growing up in inner city Detroit, me knowing the history, and then also having seeing this data that nobody else was seeing, and then through personal contacts of people that I knew whose family members had been, once upon a time involved in some of these major criminal activities, I said, well, let me do one about that, and it was called Murder City, 100 Years of Crime in Detroit, and we kind of chronicled going from all the infamous groups that the city of Detroit has created crime-wise, from the Purple Gang, which is the only totally Jewish organized crime group that ever existed, and they were one of the deadliest organized crime groups of the 1920s and 30s. They kept Al Capone out of Detroit. They participated in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago, and then we moved on into the riots and the rise of the black heroin kingpins.
You're talking about the 67 riots, correct?
Correct. Which, those occurred all around St. Louis had one, Watts, obviously,
sure.
The Detroit riot of 19... So in doing all this Detroit stuff, I found Detroit to be, I happen to be from here, but when you're talking about the social ills of America, Detroit doesn't have any that everywhere else doesn't have, but it's slightly worse here for some reason. So,
Sure.
I was shocked to find out, and you hear about in the gangster era that you think of Chicago as being the murder capital. Well, of all the northern cities, actually, Detroit was by far the most violent, was much more violent than Chicago. And then as you get into the 1943 race riot in Detroit, which we talked about in Murder City, was one of America's few actual race riots where black and white people were attacking and killing each other. And that was the deadliest riot in the 20th century until the 1967 Detroit riot, which then became the deadliest riot in the 20th century until the LA riot. But if you read this is kind of an aside, this is nerdy, crime nerd info, but I guess it's important. I was reading through the list of all the victims of the Los Angeles riot, which was supposedly like 50-some people, and there was a political motivation to make the Los Angeles riot seem, it was very horrible, but seem as bad as worse than it even was. And if, for example, there was a guy listed as a victim in the Los Angeles riot that several days after the fires had ended and all that, he got in his car to go to the grocery store. The grocery store he normally went to had been burned down in the riot, so he went to a different grocery store, and somehow he got into a verbal altercation with the produce manager at the other store who killed him, and that was listed as a riot casualty.
Statistic.
And there was a lot of stories like that in Los Angeles. So then I just got into doing, as you do one thing, and that Murder City documentary was really successful. So I got a lot of contacts out of that, and then I was able to continue to do more. And once law enforcement and people in the street saw that I really would do my homework, and I placed all these stories in a social context, it just became easier for me to do more and more projects.
Well, yeah, and you definitely, everyone go check out, and we'll get into his social networking stuff at the end, but go check out what he's done, his work. He is very, very, very thoroughly researched, and you're absolutely right, man. The D was doing things and has been doing things on a very different level, even in some of your movies, man. DEA, really veteran John Sutton said, he had been all over the country dealing, in some of these, doing
the world, all over the world.
Yeah, and he said himself, man, John Sutton from the DEA said the D was in Detroit was absolutely the worst that he had seen.
Said it was the only time I was frightened working undercover. And for those, who would know John Sutton is, John Sutton has, if you want to go on Kindle, he has a great book called White Lines that he wrote about his experience as an undercover DEA agent. But I think he was the first black undercover DEA agent. And he was sent to Detroit in 1972, and he worked cases in Mexico, South America, Baltimore, St. Louis, New York, all around the country. And he had some really, really crazy experiences here in Detroit. His informant that he was initially set up to work with was soon after. His initial target, again, Devil Jackson. The day that he arrived in Detroit, the local Detroit police told him, well, Devil Jackson got shotgunned in the face last night, so your initial target is dead. And then they introduced him to his chief informant. His chief informant was soon found dead in a field, having been eaten by field rats. And Sutton had to kind of make his way on his own in the mean streets of Detroit doing his undercover work.
Yeah, and that body had to be identified from a very, very partial print, which wasn't eaten by the field rats, if I remember from the movie there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like you said, as you start with some of this, when you pull the thread, it just starts unraveling so many different levels and layers, and you're like you said, dating back all the way to the Purple Gang. And like I said in the kind of the pre-interview, there's so many different names and so many different relevant players in all of this, dating back from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and upwards. I want to try to at least touch on a few of them. Moving up through the 40s and 50s, a very key individual, I believe his name was Henry Marzette. He was a young cop that came right out of the academy and would start doing undercover bust, and then kind of got caught up and kind of flipped sides. He was, I wouldn't say he was the start, but dating from like the 50s up, he really was the start of one of the bigger wigs, if you will, who was starting to slang in the D. Is that true? Tell us about Henry Marzette.
Well, Henry Marzette is a fascinating character. He was a black Detroit police officer in the 1950s, and in 1959, I think he was convicted of some form of corruption. So when he was in prison, he started to work with the Italians, and when he got out, he became one of the key receivers for mafia heroin in Detroit. And Henry Marzette, kind of his crew was, they were doing extortion, murder for hire, kidnapping, really, really rough bunch. And he had the big name on the streets, but as kind of these stories are also complex. Just two things to mention in relation to Henry Marzette. The Detroit was always, along with New York, the largest importation point of heroin for the mafia in the 1940s, 50s, because a guy named Badalamenti in Sicily, who was controlling all the heroin coming out of Sicily, he had family in Monroe, Michigan, which is just south of Detroit, and there were several guys here in Detroit that were receiving heroin directly from Sicily. They even had and this ties into my Killing Jimmy Hoffa documentary, a Teamsters local was basically created just for these two guys to have a cover for moving heroin around the country, and I suspect they were probably feeding Marzette and some other black dealers. And there was another guy from Detroit named John Klassen who would become a huge dealer, and I think it's hard to figure out was he supplying Marzette or was Marzette supplying him. I think what was interesting what's so interesting about the late 60s and early 70s, so as you have with the civil rights movement, black people want their rights and they want to own businesses and this and that all happened in the criminal world too. So and with the Vietnam War going on, you started to have black dealers, and I think Henry Marzette was one, who would leave their town, St. Louis or Detroit or whatever, and they would go to Thailand or somewhere themselves, such as like is portrayed in American Gangster, and not the most realistic way. But so there were other people doing that. So there was this tinderbox of activity going on, and it kind of culminated in one of America's early, deadliest, biggest drug wars that really presaged what went on later in the 80s and 90s with the coke crack wars. In the early 70s, Henry Marzette wanted to consolidate all the black dealers in Detroit and cut out the Italians, because Marzette had at this point made some kind of overseas connection of his own. And he called a meeting of two sets of people. It's called the West Side 7, who was down with Marzette, and then there was the East Side 12, who were all working for the Italians. And he called a meeting at the 20 Grand Hotel, which was owned by one of the wealthiest black men in America, a guy named Eddie Wingate, who was a big numbers runner. And so Marzette calls this meeting, and he has these Detroit's 20 biggest heroin dealers there, and he says, I got the connection. We don't need the Italians anymore. And some people went with him and some people didn't, and there was 200 people killed in the space of about 2 years. about that war, and Detroit's largest mass murder actually occurred as part of that, where 8 people were killed in a drug house, and it was it's suspected that Marzette had it done, ordered it, and it was never solved.
Okay, so and this is something I've always, as watching all of your stuff, it's so much information to digest, and something I've never always been clear on is the timeline of everything. I have the general timeline. So Marzette was in operation from the 50s up until the 70s?
Probably he went to prison in '59 for being a dirty cop, so he probably ruled the streets from 60 till then other people started hitting the scene in the late '60s, and all this drug war happened like from '70 to '72. And Marzette actually was one of he died young, he was like 50 years old, relatively young. Sure. He was one of the first people in the country to have a home dialysis kidney machine because his kidneys went bad. So that's how wealthy he was. He was one of the first people in America to have a dialysis machine at his own home. So he was on dialysis, and he ended, I guess, on his deathbed. I don't know if he was thinking about the afterlife or whatever, but he kind of ended the drug war by setting up his own chief hitman, a guy named Moody, who was this fearsome guy who killed dozens of people, was Marzette's chief hitman, and Marzette set him up to get killed, and that kind of ended things. And then Marzette died of kidney failure in 1972.
Oh wow! So he had it. Yeah, I remember hearing that. Yeah, so he had that. I guess that was his way of making amends. Okay, so moving out of the '70s, mid '70s, there. We move into another era, and help me out if I'm messing up the timeline, and let me know if how much I'm off here. There's another gentleman who comes on the scene. His name is Butch Jones. And he winds up starting a group, comes to be known as YBI, Young Boys Incorporated. I'm not sure. Let me know. What exactly year did he come on the scene?
So Butch Jones is probably Detroit's most well-known to the general public gangster, criminal of any kind. But in between that kind of time, there was some other things going on. So I did another documentary called Motown Mafia. I don't know if you saw.
Oh yeah. Eddie Jackson, absolutely. Eddie Jackson and Courtney Brown.
So they kind of inherited. Well, they didn't inherit, but I mean they kind of, when Marzette, they were in the street at the same time Marzette was. By the time Marzette died, and that whole heroin war thing was dying out, they had become the biggest dealers, and they were a little less involved in violence, and they had a
gentleman gangster, as he was called. Eddie Jackson was the gentleman.
Now I'm sure there's some dead bodies associated with him. There has
like
to
you
be.
Said, but the lore is their crew was less inclined to violence than your Chambers, your YBI, your best friends.
Right, and so the Jackson and Brown families are living out in what was at the time one of America's premier suburbs, Southfield, Michigan. The other people in the subdivision are, Smokey Robinson, people like that. The mall, Northland Mall, which served that neighborhood, was the largest furrier in the United States all up through the late 1980s. I mean, that's how much money and wealth was in that area. So going through the 70s, you have a continuation, and I talk about in my French Connection mini doc I just put up on YouTube, kind of what was going on with the heroin supply in the mid-70s. It kind of went down when we pulled out of Vietnam because CIA assets in Vietnam were helping flood the streets with drugs, but that's another story. So we transitioned through this into the late 70s. It's still the heroin era, and you have this kind of secret society of people like Eddie Jackson, Courtney Brown, Sylvester Murray, and some other people, a guy named Reginald Davis, who, when the DEA composed their first list, where they made a list of top 10 international drug violators, there was only one African-American on the list, and it was Reginald Davis. He was bringing in heroin directly from Bangkok, etc. And so what Butch Jones's genius, if you want to call it that. I mean, he kind of was the ultimate. He was really a pimp almost in a way, where he was a bully, and he gets out of prison in the late 70s after killing somebody in a robbery, and he gets with these from Dexter Avenue near West Side of Detroit, and some of the guys he knows are already doing a little something with heroin, and okay, so these stories can just go on and on. So him and this guy named Mark Marshall start YBI with $80,000 insurance policy that Mark Marshall received when his father was killed. But the circumstances of Mark Marshall's father's being killed was that Mark Marshall's father had married a woman that was the heiress. She was like the daughter or granddaughter of, I forget what it was called, but it's like Michigan National Trust or something. It was like one of the first black banks in the country, or one of the biggest or something. So he had married into this rich family. So so the father, this woman he married, their nurse, and the dog were all killed in the house and covered in semen that matched Mark Marshall's semen, but he went on trial twice for killing his father and stepmother, and there were 2 mistrials, and he ended up, they didn't try him, and he got this settlement, and him and Butch used that capital influx, and they went and saw some of the old-time guys from the Eddie Jackson and the Marzette era, like a guy named Milwaukee Jack, Reginald Davis, like I just mentioned, and they got a package of heroin, and YBI, and Butch Jones's genius was that he, like I said, he was kind of a pimp. He was able to take all these young guys, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, and turn them into this team of a drug dealing machine that just kind of took over several of the city's biggest public housing projects, controlled whole neighborhoods, and ran, like clockwork. I mean,
is it true that the basis, I forget what the name of their big building was that took the cops months and months to get in there, that was kind of the basis for the New Jack City and the Carter and the taking over that big building? Is there any accuracy to that?
Well, they, in my documentary role, and one of the guys I interviewed actually worked in this building in like 1980 when they were talking about making $70,000 a day back in 1980. And he said we were the Carter before New Jack City, but it is true that the Carter in New Jack City is directly based on something in Detroit. If you fast forward to 1986, New York journalist Barry Michael Cooper, who he's the screenwriter of New Jack City, which the Carter's from, and some other movies, he wrote an article for the Village Voice in New York called New Jack City, Detroit kills and eats its young, and he came to Detroit and saw what was going on with just a vast amount of drug activity and money. And the Chambers gang at the time, one of the Chambers brothers had this building in Detroit that was, they called it Marlowe. His nickname was Marlowe. Marlowe's One Stop, where it's $3 rocks on the first floor, $5 rocks on the second floor, $8 rocks, $20 rocks.
So the Chamber brothers are operating. I was going to ask you about these guys. So the Chamber brothers are operating at the same time that Butch is starting to get going?
No, Butch gets going about 79 and goes away in about 84, 83. And that's right when the cocaine era really crack hit the streets hard in 84. So by the time crack hits the streets, Butch Jones is in federal prison. And then you have these, this kind of changeover where...
so what happens to the YBI around that time? Because I remember seeing a picture in Roland of my man B. Skata. He was 1988. He's still.
Oh yeah, that's the most amazing chain I've ever seen. No rapper had everything. For those who haven't seen the film, I have a picture in there where it's from the late '80s, and he has on this big rope chain, and the medallion is about, it's about a foot by a foot, and it's a map of the United States, and then it has diamonds in every city where they sold drugs at.
Big diamond.
And so here's what's interesting. So YBI got indicted in late '82. That was before the real draconian drug laws kicked in, which happened in about '86. So even though YBI was a huge operation, the guys that, I mean, there were people who got life because they got actually caught with large amounts of drugs or murders and all that. But as far as the RICO indictment, Butch, who was the boss of this huge operation, he only, he got 8 or 9 years. A lot of the lieutenants got, 24 months. I mean, so they were back on the street. So they were part of a lot of those same guys were, got then involved in the crack business, cocaine business.
And it's, by this time, the YBI has kind of fizzled out?
No, there was a second. So in 87, there was a second YBI indictment, and a bunch of the guys were indicted in prison for continuing to guide operations out on the street. So there was a second YBI indictment, which included police officers and blah blah blah. So YBI was a ghost that haunts the streets of Detroit right now. I mean, there's still of the few guys that still can make some serious things happen. I mean, some of them are still people that are left over from the last men standing from way back then, and they were 14 years old selling dope on the corner for YBI in 1980, and now they're 60 years old and they're still.
Well, speaking of one of the old heads, man, even before some of these guys, dating back, I think, to around the Marzette time, or maybe even a little later, a gentleman by the name of Frank Nitty Usher, who was very integral into a lot of this stuff that went down, that wound up escaping a life prison sentence himself. Recently, I forget, within the last few years, 70-plus years old, got caught up with some heroin stuff again. Did you hear about that?
Yes, he's out, and they're working on some kind of deal. It wasn't the news made a big deal out of it because of his name. I mean, we've talked to his lawyer. They didn't seem too concerned. I mean, either the case will go away or he'll do some, 2 years or something. But he wasn't caught doing any hand-to-hands or anything. But yeah, he was still around. I mean, so yeah, for those people who don't know who he is, and in 1979, 3 beheaded bodies were found in a van in Detroit, and so there ends up being this big murder trial. And Frank Nitty Usher, who had become the primary receiver. He was still at that point getting drugs from the Italians. We think he was one of the few people they would deal with. He got convicted of being involved in this murder. And but he did about 9 years or so, or 5 years, or 7 years.
Well, the defense lawyer, Stephen Fishman, was a master at getting a great many of them folks off on some serious charges.
Oh, so he got triple life, and he did about 9 years, and then they come back. He gets an appeal, and they turn it into that. They say that the killers were there to kill Frank too, but he managed to talk them out of it, but they made him help dispose of the bodies. So then his triple murder went away, and it became accessory after the fact of murder, which is just a 0 to 5 sentence.
Because I was wondering when Stephen Fishman described that, and as to why because he was saying how he convinced the judge that he was the target, and he said something like through will or force of personality or move to the side. I'm like, I was just wondering how the hell.
Oh, it doesn't make. Oh, that whole. I mean.
I'm just wondering how that played out.
I'll just say this. I mean, many criminal cases are not decided in the courtroom. They're decided with, bags of money and
right. Well, you're talking
certain
about
judges, and,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's anywhere. That's probably Detroit at it worse, but definitely Detroit. So I don't know what happened in that case. I mean, that's a pretty implausible, unbelievable sounding story, but hey, I wasn't there, so how do I know? Who knows?
Not to divert too much, I just wanted, that was a little sidebar on Frank Usher there. So YBI version 2 goes away, and the other crew that I heard about in this Gangland show was called the Best Friends, and this is around this time, right? This is kind of Butch's enforcement team, the A team and the
no, they didn't. No. Best Friends didn't. Best Friends were on the east side.
Oh, okay.
So the Best Friends were
them, the Brown.
There's four the Brown brothers, four brothers, and they're close couple friends, and they start off in the mid '80s when they're 16, 17. They start getting involved in doing murder for hire. So and then there's another group called the Monster Crew that was also doing murder for hire on the east side, and they were kind of in conflict. And so, I mean, I read the FBI report, and the Best Friends described them as the most murderous drug ring in the United States history. I mean, they linked them to like 80 murders, but I mean, the Best Friends weren't like, the Crips, like there was 1,000 of them. Right. There was like 10, 15 of them,
Yeah, they were scary.
And,
I forget who's doing life now. We ran after the dude. The guy ran into his house. Whatever.
Oh yeah, Rockin' Reggie Brown. Yeah, no, they were known for, if they were driving down the street and they saw you and you had a hit out on you, or they were looking for you for personal reasons, they would stop the car, get out and kill you. If they saw you in the mall, they'd kill you in the mall.
Yeah. That's true. There was in the late 80s, there was a big shootout in the Detroit Mall. You could probably look it up. That was involving these guys.
Well, there's been several shootings. I mean, it's just as bad now. There's been several shootings at that same mall in the last 2 years.
Well, I mean, another crew. I don't want to keep you too long. We could go off on each of these groups forever, and there's some more I want to get to. So the Chambers brothers, where did these guys fit in? Because they also play a key role. One of them, a gentleman we can talk about, I guess, in this story. He happened to be a Caucasian gentleman by the name of Rick Wershey, who was like 17 years old. He happened to have been dating. Tell me about that. Tell me about the Chambers brothers, Rick Wershey, who he was dating, and her affiliation to the mayor and political.
Oh, well, yeah, you can talk about that forever. So there's a Hollywood movie in the works for that right now.
Oh, really?
It's revising the script. It's the same people that did the Whitey Bulger movie.
Oh, okay.
It's a big deal. They've been in town. Blah blah blah.
Rick Wershey, this kid is doing a life still, by the way. He was 17 and got caught up and still doing life.
So 1983, YBI goes down. Cocaine is coming in. Joint federal and Detroit Police Task Force. Okay, we took down YBI. Who's going to be our next? Who's our primary target? Who are the biggest drug dealers in the city? They target these guys, the Curry brothers on the east side. Johnny Curry was married to the mayor of Detroit's niece at the time. So to infiltrate is one of, they were tapping their phones and all the normal stuff, but one of the tactics they did to infiltrate the Currys, and this, my partner Scott Bernstein has validated this with the police and the DEA. This stuff sounds made up, but this happened. This has been validated. This kid, Richard Wershey, white kid, he said he tried, was 14 or 13 at the time. His father was a gun dealer and had been kind of on the fringes of criminal stuff, and he had a relationship with the FBI, gave them some info about stuff. So he basically let the police pay him to use his 13-year-old son to infiltrate the Curry boys because they lived like on the same block as them. So the police start giving white boy Rick money and having him act like he's selling drugs and he's hanging out. And so he slowly kind of gets them to the Curry organization. Johnny Curry becomes suspicious of him. He has another young guy shoot Rick to kill him, but Rick doesn't die. He wakes up in a hospital bed, and the police are standing there and they say, look, don't say anything. We want you to go back with Johnny Curry and act like you don't know why he shot you. You had your shot. And you can find this article in the news because I have. It's a little small article about two teenagers playing with one of their parents' handgun on Detroit's east side. One shot the other, and the homeowner's insurance is going to pay out a $50,000 settlement. So Rick got paid the settlement money for getting shot because the police participated in basically insurance fraud to get him paid and keep him shut up. So he keeps working with them. The Curry brothers get brought down. Johnny Curry's wife.
In there. That's insane.
Yeah. So when he goes back in there, now they're like, oh shit, well he can't be the rat.
Right.
So he really is in with Johnny Curry. And so finally, the Curry brothers go down, but Rick doesn't stop selling drugs. Rick, they made him a drug dealer, but now he really is one, and he continues, and they made him out to be one of the biggest drug dealers in the city, which he was not, but he was a big drug dealer. I mean, he was dealing in multi-kilos. He wasn't getting 100 kilos, but he was dealing multi-kilos. He's still dating, so now the Johnny Curry's wife, Mayor's niece.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Is he on his own doing this, or is he still working for the cops? Okay.
No. He's on it. The cop said, "We're done with you. We brought the Currys down." But
okay.
he continues on his own. But also part of the reason he's able to continue is the mayor's niece, now that her husband's in prison, the day her husband goes to prison, she calls White Boy Rick up, who's like 16 or 17 at the time, and she's like 25, and basically says, "I'm your new girlfriend," takes him to meet the Cuban connection, Johnny Curry's Cuban cocaine connection. And so now Coleman Young, the mayor, assigns his part of his security detail, because he knows his niece is dating these drug dealers, to follow his niece around at all times and protect her. But she was with Johnny Curry, then she's with White Boy Rick, and they're doing drug deals while this protection squad is outside watching them, they're just there to protect her in case some bullets break out. They're not there to stop any other kind of crime. So Rick eventually, they catch him with a big load of cocaine. He beats the case. Then they catch him again, and he could have took a 3 or 5 year plea deal. He tries to send a bribe to the judge. That gets taken. He goes to trial. He loses. He's been in jail ever since. He's been in jail since 1988 when he was 18 years old for 8 kilos of cocaine.
Wow. That's heavy. That'd be an interesting movie. That'd be a very. I saw. I don't know who did the film King Rat on the.
Flip Wilson. Yeah, it was kind of it was a little bit all over the place, but.
Yeah. So that I mixed up the Chambers with the Currys. So the Currys, where does the Chambers brothers fit into this timeline?
Well, they were during that same era, and they shared a drug supplier with White Boy Rick. And this shows, the lunacy of the drug law. So it's almost like the lower you are on the food chain, the more time you get in prison. There was this white guy named Art Derrick in Detroit, who had a jet and was bringing cocaine from Miami. I mean, he was a real drug kingpin. And he was supplying Chambers Brothers. And Chambers Brothers were infamous because they actually set up, they were like the next YBI in the sense that they had the retail outlet. It wasn't about, I'm going to get 10 kilos and then put a couple $1,000 profit on them and sell them to somebody else. They're getting 10 kilos every other day and cutting them into nickel rocks, and they got 100 crack houses around the city.
And what years are these for the Chambers?
They were operative from about 84 to 88, 89.
Okay, so there's some overlay on all these kind of operations a little bit.
They're all together. White Boy Rick has a baby, I think, with this White Boy Rick has a baby with a girl that I think one of the Chambers has a baby with her too, or they had the same girlfriend at the same time. Yeah, it's all overlapping, and it's all kind of the same. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, and this, like I said, this is all kind of, the information is quite layered and very well researched, as you can hear. You can go check out Roland, and there's other ones, but I think he does the best job. I think Al does the best job kind of breaking it all down. He gets a lot of really good guests to really kind of break all this down. And a lot of this really kind of, this is such a huge operation. I think people even realize, like, some of these guys are making so many, like, several $1 million a day. I recently interviewed the real Freeway Rick Ross, and part of his distribution network, actually YBI and some of the stuff in Detroit was a part of his distribution network. So it was,
Yeah, he came through Detroit. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was really, really vast. And not to move along too fast, a gentleman that really, a guy, like you said, Frank Lucas gets lamented, American Gangster. Like, I mean, it's not about how cool you were when you sold drugs. However, he gets lamented as this huge drug dealer, which he kind of just held down parts of New York and Harlem. When in fact, the real dude who I think was had to have been tied in governmentally, was a gentleman by the name of Frank Matthews. He supplied the country, the world. Like, he was a big time dealer. And I'm not even talking about like street level dealer. The guy was, like I said, was supplying states. and he wound up, just after he got indicted, just disappearing. But as like Al said, he breaks down again very succinctly in his video called The French Connection, which is on my webpage, which I use to kind of promote Al coming on today. Talks about how he, the levels of involvement of, his possible government dealings. Talk to me a little bit about Frank Matthews.
So Frank Matthews grows up in Durham, North Carolina, and he leaves in the I don't know, 64 or something. He's 18 years old, come up to the big city to make his fortune. And somehow, by the late 60s, he's dealing with some very high up Latin gangsters in New York. And I think what I've been able to piece together now, I think that he probably, and this ties into the JFK assassination and the Bay of Pigs and all that. When Fidel Castro took power, of course, the U.S. government, wanted Fidel out. So Cubans in America who could help the U.S. government do dirty work were kind of given get-out-of-jail-free cards. And I think that they were the key connection between dealing with the heroin coming in from Southeast Asia or Europe, and they would be the conduit to the black dealers. And I think Frank Matthews was able to, by the age of 29, 30 years old, he was orchestrating his buys in Venezuela. He was getting, French Connection was bringing in heroin for him to pick up in Venezuela and flood the streets of America. He was supplying the biggest dealers in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Connecticut, Brooklyn, blah, 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 blah. The list goes on. When I first started researching Matthews, he almost seemed like not a real, like a Kaiser Sose, like a made up, sure. Like this couldn't be true. But if you watch the Frank Matthews documentary, we have the federal prosecutors and the agents that worked the case saying, no, Frank controlled the Eastern Seaboard.
Yeah.
He, there's stories of, one of the guys tells a story of, Frank one night giving him a bag with like $900,000 and saying, hold this, and forgets to even come get it. And like a month passes, and the guy sees him, and he's like, Frank, when are you going to come pick that money up? And Frank's like, what money? The $1 million you gave me. And so that's.
And he's like, are you broke? He's like, then keep it. Then keep the money.
Yeah, just keep it, yeah.
In a very, very interesting kind of tidbit to this, because this is always kind of how it happens sometimes, these kind of like accidental things which bust cases wide open. One of the things that had him pop up on law enforcement's radar, at least local law enforcement, because I think he was tied in at the top, I think one of the things that had him pop up on local law enforcement, he was living in the same apartment building as, who was it, the chief of police or some huge lieutenant or somebody high up in the police?
Oh, no, it was a kind of a regular cop who had just gotten promoted, I think, to like being a sergeant or something, so he had a little more money, and his wife's like, well, let's move to a nicer apartment building. And they're in this apartment building, and there's like this loudmouth black guy in mink coat, and he's always on the elevator, and he's talking crazy. So the cop starts kind of watching him, and he starts taking pictures of all the license plates that are showing up. And the license plates are all coming back to the biggest drug dealers in, like I said, Baltimore, other parts of New York, Philadelphia, all over the country. And then that's how this case gets opened, and then the feds come in. And Frank Matthews was actually the target of something called Centac, which is, I don't know if it's been discontinued, but it was used from the early 70s up till, it may still be being used now, but at least up till recently, Central Tactical. That was where at the highest federal level, the Department of Justice, they would coordinate local police, DEA, ATF, FBI, CIA, whoever they needed to go after the biggest drug targets in the country. And Frank Matthews was Centac number 2. The first one was Pleasant Avenue, Italians in the South Bronx, and then number 2 was Frank Matthews. He was when he was in the federal government's crosshairs, he was considered the largest drug dealer in the United States.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because you hear, like, again, you hear so many of these other supposedly some prolific, famous, quote-unquote, infamous drug dealers, Frank Lucas, Nicky Barnes, if you will. I'm 42 years old, and I enjoy all of these kind of stories and hearing about all these. I'd never heard of Frank Lucas or Frank Matthews, and that's not to say I'm, got the pulse on this stuff, but again, folks, when you go check this out, and I think it's called, what's it called, the Frank Matthews, what's the actual name of the movie?
Story.
The Frank Matthews
story.
Yeah, go check it out. It's on YouTube, or you can buy it. It's on YouTube. The Frank Matthews story. You can go check out Roland. We're gonna move away from some of that. I mean, like I said, there's so many layers to this. We could talk about it forever, and it's very, very fascinating, folks. And like you can hear, Al's really on point when it comes to this stuff. The next movie and another movie that you recently came out, like again, as a big history buff and a big JFK guy, it was called the Killing Jimmy Hoffa. Man, that thing was awesome. And, it's always kind of conjecture. Everybody's, he's buried under the goalposts of the New York, all these different stories of where Jimmy Hoffa, what happened to him. And you have some very, very good insight. Once again, if you can kind of break this flick down and tell folks a little bit about it.
So, Killing Jimmy Hoffa was my most recent one, and that obviously is about Jimmy Hoffa, but he's kind of become a punchline of a joke, Jimmy Hoffa's buried under this or that building. Sure. But he, in studying his life and career, so in the documentary, about the second, the last half of it is kind of the days leading up to his disappearance and the investigation afterwards. But the first half is about his rise from being this kind of like Frank Matthews. I mean, he was just this little country kid in rural Indiana, and then his family comes to Detroit, and he joins the Teamsters. And through just his force of will, I mean, he rises up the Teamster ranks, and this is during the time of American economic expansion through World War II. And he becomes the most powerful union leader and one of the most powerful men, actually, in the United States. And for those of you who've seen them, I could tell a million Jimmy Hoffa stories, but one interesting thing, just so people understand, because you hear Teamsters and Teamster Pension Fund, and what does all that really mean? Well, in the movie Casino, you know how they get the money, they get the loan to buy the casino, and then at the end, they when they're doing the hits, they knock off all the financial people back in Chicago. Well, that all really happened, and that's the story of Casino is really the story of the Teamster Pension Fund. It's about how the Teamster Pension Fund, which was the money taking out of Teamsters checks, and for those who don't, I mean, the Teamsters was the largest union in the United States. There were like 2 million members in the 1960s. So the Teamster Pension Fund was the single biggest pool of money in the United States, I mean, other than the government, right? It had billions and billions and billions of dollars back when $1 billion really meant something. So the whole first wave of the Las Vegas Strip was built off loans from the Teamster Pension Fund, which obviously Jimmy Hoffa had some degree of control over. And the Teamsters were, again, we go into the Teamster connection with heroin. I talked about early on in the conversation about the two Detroit mafioso who were receiving heroin from Sicily and were two of the biggest dealers in the country in the 1950s and early 60s. They had their own Teamster local created for them, which I can only imagine was, having access to trucks that you can load up and send around. I mean, it's pretty useful for distributing drugs. And we talk about Hoffa's CIA connections. There had always been those rumors, and probably a lot of people still think they're rumors, that the CIA tried to work with the mafia to kill Castro. But in fact, about, 5 or 6 years ago, the CIA released, and for those interested, you can Google it, they released something called the Family Jewels, where they released a bunch of information about old operations that actually validated a bunch of these conspiracy theories, one of which was that they in fact did in 1960 make contact with Sam Giancana and through Jimmy Hoffa and others, and tried to see that any of the mafia have contacts still left in Cuba, because before Castro took power of the mafia in Meyer Lansky, they had casinos and stuff going on in Cuba, so they wanted to see if the mafia could help them assassinate Castro.
Yeah, that's pretty well documented, dating back even to the Eisenhower administration.
Absolutely.
So yeah, and then so that leads like you said, if everyone wants to go see it, it's called Killing Jimmy Hoffa.
Killing Jimmy Hoffa. It's on. You can go to Amazon Prime. It's free, or you can rent it streaming. You can go on my website, alprofit.com. We got a great great streaming thing on there. All the films. So you can just Google any of these films, and there's a variety of ways to watch them.
Or even your name, Al Prophet, then you'll definitely, all that stuff will come up. And I mean, in that movie, it obviously brings up the Kennedy assassination. You can't really bring up Hoffa and the mafia and stuff without bringing up that era, which is, conspiracy theory of, obviously, there's so many theories, but they do speak about his supposed role and the mafia's role in the assassination of the president.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it's the hatred of Bobby Kennedy and Jimmy Hoffa is well documented. They had a really bizarre relationship when, in what year would this have been? 58 or something.
Committee really started their adversarial relationship when he was testifying, when Hoffa was testifying in front of the McClellan Committee.
Well, Hoffa was actually charged with attempted bribery and something else because he tried to buy some documents from Bobby Kennedy's office from a guy who set him up, and the FBI sat outside and wasn't videotaped, then filmed Hoffa making the payoff, and he was arrested. So he's taken down to the courthouse in D.C. to be arraigned. Bobby Kennedy's there. The two of them, I mean, I don't know what this says about kind of guys they were, or just the weirdness of the whole thing. They're arguing with each other. They had a push-up contest in the courthouse, while Hoffa's being arraigned.
Really?
So, and here's this is a little story here, and I'm one of the things that's, I'm a history buff. I don't just know history. I shouldn't say buff. I'm very knowledgeable about history in general. We could talk about, I know a lot about the Roman Empire and ancient China or whatever, but what's interesting about studying crime, it gives you kind of a lens into American society. Sure. And so it's 1959. Hoffa goes on trial. Now, in 1959, there were huge swaths of the country where black people weren't even allowed to vote, right? But this is in Washington, D.C., which was even then mostly black. So Jimmy Hoffa is tried in front of a black jury, right? And they have Jimmy Hoffa. I mean, they have him on film making the he's guilty, But who should make an appearance and walk into the court and make a big ostentatious show of shaking Jimmy Hoffa's hand and saying, "Thank you for what you've done for my people," and sitting next to him, Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber. So the black jury in Washington, D.C. finds Jimmy Hoffa not guilty.
Wow. That makes sense. Yeah, a celebrity, hell, let's just forget about what you might have done.
Well, what did a black woman in 1959 who was probably working for peanuts as a maid for somebody who was in Congress, what does she care about Bobby Kennedy's office getting bribed? What does she care? What's justice to her?
That's Joe
what's justice?
Right.
Yeah, so what's justice? And hey, and if Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters have given a bunch of good paying jobs to black people, I don't care what you did.
One man's right doer, or whatever it is, the whole one man's
one man's right is another wrong. That's right. Yeah. That's right.
Man, we could go on forever, but we're already pushing an hour, and I don't want to keep you too much longer. Again, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Al Prophet. You can go online, go to his website. Shout out your Twitter or any of your social networking stuff, my friend.
At the real Al Prophet is my Twitter, and you can catch me on Facebook, Al Prophet Bradley. And then my YouTube channel, which is really, you can go see all this stuff, is just youtube.com/Al Prophet.
There you go. There you go. Well, you, my friend, you have been quite informative, and I'm probably going to just follow up this interview after I get done and watch me some rolling. But I can't let you go unless I have you step in and emerge successfully, my friend, from the conspiracy triangle of doom. It is very simple, my friend. 3 very simple questions, which you can answer yes or no, or you can elaborate if you will, if you so choose. Question number 1. Do you, sir, Al Prophet, believe in the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence?
I believe in the existence of life. I don't what the word intelligence, like human consciousness intelligence.
No. And it's, I mean, something, I don't know, it could be a blob.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's. There's life. I don't know if the thing is. I've been thinking lately. I think that becoming as intelligent as humans are is actually not good in an evolutionary sense.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the dinosaurs ruled the planet for 100 million years. Humans aren't. I mean, we're gonna. The odds of destroying ourselves are much greater than 0.
Yeah.
So, my personal theory now is why we haven't been in contact with any other thinking beings, at least, or conscious beings, is that maybe once you get to be this smart, you don't last too much longer.
Right. Well,
destroy yourself in some way. So I do think there's life of some kind.
Right.
In other places. Absolutely.
That word intelligence is a little subjective, but I feel you. Cool, man. Question number 2, and I think I might know your answer, but I will ask you anyway. Do you follow the narrative, or do you believe in the official version of events of November 22nd, 1963? Lee Harvey Oswald.
Well, there's so many different versions of events, but I'll just say this.
One. Do you believe the Lee Harvey?
The Warren report? No. I mean, I think, and to go back to the Jimmy Hoffa, just to tie back Jimmy Hoffa real quick, for me, there's so many people involved in the JFK thing, and the waters are so muddied. I don't know if it could really be definitively figured out exactly what happened at this point. But the smoking gun to me is that Jack Ruby was definitely tied in with the mafia.
Sure.
And for him to go kill Lee Harvey Oswald in the basement of the Dallas Police Department is absurd. So it's the smoking gun for me. So, no, I don't believe the Warren Commission's final report.
All right. I'm feeling you there, my friend. I'm feeling you there. All right, question number 3. Along the same lines of following a narrative, do you believe, or do you follow the official narrative of the events of 9/11, September the 11th, 2001?
Well, it would be. I mean, I don't know what you mean by the official.
The equivalent of the Warren Commission, the 9/11 report. The Pentagon got hit by a plane. Hijackers. Because of course on the other side you have controlled demolition. You have.
I don't think there was a controlled demolition. I think that those guys did it, but I think that there was a massive failing on the part of U.S. intelligence, and just like what police always do and government officials always do, a lot of these conspiracies, they're not even about that somebody set out to do something evil in the first place. It's that something happened that shows their incompetence or undermines their authority, so then they cover it up. I mean, look at why politicians go to jail half the time, or look at all the baseball players in the steroid scandal. They're not, as Roger Clemens just said, yeah, I shot steroids, well, there's no real punishment for that. But when you go under oath in front of Congress and lie and say you didn't, now you committed a different crime.
It's the lie.
So, yeah, I don't think it was controlled demolition, but I think that if you really unraveled, they should have been able to stop it. And I think, and actually I'm going to do a mini documentary about Saudi Arabia because I'm interested in Saudi Arabia's role and everything. Saudi Arabia, our closest Arab ally, because they're the richest Arab country, all the hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. They didn't come from Iraq.
Right.
So why did we attack Iraq?
Well, there's definitely
the money. and the money that supports Islamic terrorism primarily has been coming from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is run by a very
it's also
hardcore
our biggest ally in the Arab nation.
That's right, but yet they're the most. They're not Sunni or Shia. They're Wahhabists, which is a very extreme form of Islam, and yet they're our closest ally. The Saudi Arabia is the single largest in the last 40 years. They're the single largest purchaser of armaments from the United States, and the U.S. defense industry makes a lot of people a lot of money.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
I don't think it was controlled demolition, but I think there's a lot more to the story that would really make us question our loyalty to a lot of the
and it's almost like
people that run our government.
It was almost like the Kennedy thing, that the waters have gotten so muddied in the last 15 years from controlled demolition to there was no plane to the plane, all the different stories now. So it just becomes one of them things where it really gets.
Yeah, there is no truth. There is no truth. I mean, I've come to that. That's a saying I kind of come to with a lot of these cases, the Frank Matthews, all of them. Sometimes when there's so much information, there's no information. Because think of it this way: if you wanted to hide, so if a piece of information exists, it can never be made to unexist, right? There's some truth. Something happened, right? Yeah. I can't unkill JSK, but how do I hide that piece of information? Well, if the more misinformation that exists around it, and the more times you turn on TV and see some crazy person, how you can see the face of the devil over the Twin Towers before, just all these different things, you just tune out after a while, and you say, you know what, let me just go to work and eat my chicken wings and watch football game, and, I'm not going to think about it.
And I think a lot of that's by design. I think that's a whole other conversation.
Oh, 100%.
The level of social engineering that almost dumbs you down from anyway thinking about anything, critical.
Oh no, that's standard. The CIA developed those techniques, and other people. That's absolutely done on purpose. Yeah. It's absolutely. They love to have conspiracy theorists and kooks, because if a guy looks kooky, he might be saying the truth, but because of the way he looks, or because he says, and here's where you have to be careful and not try to be with my stuff. If you say one crazy thing that turns out to be not true, it undermines. You might have said 99 other things that were true, but they're looking for one thing to undermine you. It's like you're on the witness stand. If they catch you, you stole. Well, you said you went to the store at 7:15, but it was was it 7:30? Oh, it was 7:30. So you're a liar. So everything else you said isn't true.
And that's you're absolutely true. I mean, especially in this world of information, especially if you're going to spew about it, and it really is incumbent on the person talking about it to really know what the hell they're talking about, because, like you said, one chink in your armor, it really kind of undermines the rest of the stuff you're talking about, and people do, like you said, kind of tend to tune out. Cool, man. Shit, I could. Like I said, bro, I'm gonna have you on again, because we didn't get into the Police State movie too much. So we're gonna link up again sometime down the road, my friend, and talk about some of your next projects, and that would include Police State. Is that all right with you?
Yes, sir.
Cool, man. This has been my pleasure, my friend. I thank you so very much for taking the time. Again, this has been Al Prophet, awesome documentary filmmaker / historian, and, sounds like a cool-ass dude, man. Check out his work. You will not be disappointed, man. This guy is thorough.
AlProphet.com. Thanks for having me on. Talk to you later.
All right, brother. That's Al Prophet. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been me speaking to you. Stay tuned.